asking you guys, how many of you have tasted a 100-point wine? Show of hands. How many people have tasted a 100-point wine in the audience? Up here, Stefan, really? Yeah, okay. So that sort of leads to the next thing, which is what exactly is a 100-point wine? And what makes a wine 100 points? And for us, you know, Robert Parker, when he established the publication, you know, basically outlined what that meant. And wines are scored according to his rubric, which allows up to 5 points for appearance and color, up to 15 points for aroma, 20 points for flavor and finish, and 10 points for overall quality and ability to improve with age. So that's the sort of rough Robert Parker scoring rubric, and that's what we're supposed to be judging the wines on. In actuality, I think many people don't actually go through and tick those sort of individual boxes, because when we're tasting 3,000 wines a piece in a year, that's just too much extra work. So we have in our minds what these top wines are, and we sort of do the mental calculus every time we go through. So these are wines that either the people up here at the front of the room or preceding reviewers who are no longer part of the team, have reviewed as being 100-point wines. Take that for what it is. It may be that some of the wines don't seem like 100 points to you today, and that's okay. They may not seem 100 points to us today. There's no absolute, I would say, when it comes to tasting wine, and on top of that, every bottle is different. You know, most of these wines, I think all of them actually, and this are sealed with natural cork, so there's going to be a certain amount of variability inherent in that as the wines age. But we're going to start with a pretty young wine and a nice white to get us started. So, Stefan.
Thank you, Joe. Can you hear me? Is that correct? Okay, I'm the first because I have the only white, and you know, when we have a team meeting or so and I bring any white, I have always be the first, because it's always thought that the white wine from Germany, Austria or Alsace, it's aperitif wine. So this one is definitely not. So you probably know the Grüne Veltliner or the Unendlich brand from FX Pichler. And a funny fact, this is the only wine that Robert Parker called me when he had it in his glass somewhere in the US, and said, "Stefan, can you please explain me what is that for an amazing wine?" And that was, at the time, I have never been a great fan of the Unendlich, to be honest, because it was the idea to put the maximum what a great variety can deliver into one bottle. So for me, it was always an excessive wine. The first vintage was a Riesling, 1998, which was a Botrytis vintage in the Wachau or in Lower Austria, and then for many years, more than 10 years, always the idea was always to make an extremely rich and concentrated wine. So Botrytis was always included. And from Franz Xaver, so the father of today's Lucas, and he invented the wine, yeah. And then in 2011, his son Lucas took over, and he completely changed the concept of all his wines, but also of the Unendlich, which is today based only on super ripe, but never overripe or never Botrytis grape varieties, and also his single vineyard wines are. And this, in fact, the 2018 vintage is a single vineyard wine. It's not mentioned because Unendlich has always been a blend, but in 2018 it's a 100% Kellerberg. which is one of the top sites. By the way, we are in the Wachau, of course, in Lower Austria, where and the interesting point is that Kellerberg, it's facing south, but it's also facing east, and it's going in a side valley where it is much cooler. In the night there comes the cold stream from the mountain, and this helps the Riesling as well as the Veltliner, and this unendlich a lot, because this wine is not extremely rich still, but what fascinates me, or did, even in a hot vintage like 2018, was this incredible finesse and vitality this wine had, and the salinity and everything what I'm looking for in a great wine from the Wachau. It was here, and if you see the tasting note is now gone. I was shocked when I read it this morning. Normally I don't write so long tasting notes, and many things were redundant, but I was obviously emotionally touched by this wine, and I remember it very well. So I'm normally a critic that I have, of course, a certain style. I like very much the straightforward, structured, vibrant style, and this wine is completely the opposite of it. But so I really couldn't believe that it's the first unendlich that I really adored, and I didn't taste it now, so I hope it can hold at least 99% of the 100. I will be glad. It's a wine that is fermented for 1 year in a 500 liter case from in a Meursault barrel, and it has been aged on a full lees for 1 year, and it's fermented spontaneously, so no added yeast. Yeah, and as I told you, 18, I'm sure you know, was extremely warm and dry and early harvest. And the wines, especially Veltliner, which is not very attractive for botrytis because the skins are thicker than Riesling, and you normally have a lower acidity, and normally in warm years the Veltliner can get very broad and very powerful and rich and tropical. You find the tropical flavors here, but also, as I find, the terroir, so the soil it's gneiss and mica schist, so it's a very acidic soil, and yeah, I think that all helps. Yeah, I think my 5 minutes are gone.
I was trying to be subtle.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks. I think Stefan touched on something there that is important when you think about 100-point wines. He touched on emotion. And I think that's something we generally feel when we review a wine at 100 points. There's something that gives it that little extra, that little something that pushes it up to that level. Luis, why don't you take over?
Yeah. So it's me next, wine from Argentina. And in fact, what Joe was saying, when people ask me, what is a 100-point wine for you? And I say, it's a wine that makes my heart beat faster. So it's very much about emotion and, and context. Taken out of context and tasted, in a cold environment might not seem like a very exciting wine. You have to follow, different vintages, the place, the winemaker. To me, the places, the people are very, very important. This is a very young wine from Argentina, from a young winery called Aleana, which is the blend of names of the winemaker, Alejandro Vigil, and Adriana Catena from the Catena winery. So it's a joint venture in Mendoza, which you have a little bit of a map there to see where we are. And within Argentina, which is very, very concentrated in the province of Mendoza, where they produce like 90% of the wines from the country, they have been looking for places rather than grapes. And this wine, if you smell, you can guess it's not Malbec. So there's more than Malbec in Argentina. And there's more to Mendoza than just Mendoza. So some time ago they started looking at high altitude, and that is important. But then they started looking at the soils, and the difference here is the soil. We're not talking about tiny vineyards. I want to show. This is the photo of the Adriana vineyard in Gualtallarí, which is the tongue twister name of the place. This is a place within the Valle de Uco in Mendoza. So they have been talking more and more about places, but even within the places, the vineyards are huge, you know. It's quite different to the vineyards here in Switzerland. I remember the first time I went to the Valais and I asked to the guys, you know, about their yields, and I was expecting, you know, to hear about kilos per hectare, and they talk about grams per square meter. Yeah. You don't do that in Argentina. And in fact, they are looking at the soil. You know, in Europe, we more or less know our regions and we know our soils, but in other continents, they are still exploring their terroirs. And in Gualtallarí, they have discovered something that is very scarce in Argentina, which is limestone. Limestone is one of the very classical soils for quality wines. And this is mostly Cabernet Franc with a little bit of Malbec, which is a new combination that they have found that works very well. Of course, outside of Europe, they don't have indigenous grapes, so they have all European grapes. And they planted mostly Cabernet Sauvignon and Malbec. But then I think Cabernet Sauvignon adapts a little bit worse than Cabernet Franc to the different climates. And now Cabernet Franc is working very well, and this blend of Cabernet Franc with a little bit 15 to 30% Malbec, I think works very well. This is 13. To me, it's still very young. I think that ideally we should taste these wines in 40 years, and then we would see if they are really 100 points. But would we be 100 points in 40 years? Who knows?
The winemaker.
Oh yeah, that's yeah. Context is important, so you have to see the face of the people who make the wine. This has to be an interesting wine, huh?
Thanks, Luis. Next up is one of the wines I reviewed. So it's the 2016 Torbreck Run Rig. So it's labeled Shiraz Viognier, but the Viognier component's tiny. It's only 2%. It's blended in just prior to bottling. So there you have it. It's it's a relatively young winery from a very old wine region. So the winery is just founded in 1994. It's been through a change of ownership already, and you can see some of the famous winemakers who've passed through there making great Barossa wines already. So Dan Standish, Craig Isbell, Fraser McKinley, Dave Powell, who founded the winery. And the current winemaker is Ian Hongel, and he used to work at Peter Lehman, so pretty nearby, making also sort of classic Barossa wines. You see the picture of the viticulturalist, because that's really where Torbreck, for me, the quality starts. That's where they made their name for themselves in buying a lot of really old vine fruit and paying a lot more than all the neighbors were going to pay for it. So Dave Powell is not a shy guy. He would just sort of not a shy guy, and he would basically just walk into old vineyards, like what he saw, and find out who owned them, and said, well, "What are they paying you? Well, I'll pay you 2 times, 3 times, sometimes 5 times as much as the growers were getting paid by their current contracts." And really upset quite a few people in the Barossa, because they had a pretty tidy business model going on. But this is what makes wine interesting, is that there are instigators, that there are people who make a difference and who are catalysts for change, I guess. And so Torbreck was one of those. But the wines evolved a little bit over time, and I think The 2016 we have here, it shows more refinement probably than the earlier versions of Run Rig, which were even more about power and weight than this particular wine is. So, yeah, I mean, look, it's Barossa. It's hot. It's South Australia. It's red earth over some limestone soil. But that's what it is. It's no apologies, right? It's big, bold Barossa flavor. Plenty of time in oak. And for me, I love it. Not everyone is a fan of the style, but that's okay. This is again what makes wine interesting and why it's fun to try wines that someone thinks are great, because we can all have opinions on whether they are or not. All right, what's next? Monica, Italy.
Thank you, Joe. So the next two wines are back-to-back Italy. I have the great honor of being able to present two wines in this tasting. They are actually both from Tuscany, and that's really just maybe a coincidence because, of course, Italy has beautiful wines in Piedmont, in Barolo, Barbaresco. Italy has a huge collection of indigenous grapes and lots of diversity. But it was kind of interesting that these two wines were chosen for this tasting because we have one, the first one made with an indigenous grape, Sangiovese, and the second one with a so-called international grape, Merlot. So the first wine is the 2016 Flaccianello della Pieve from Fontodi. The owner of Fontodi, his name is Giovanni Manetti, and he's actually downstairs today. I saw him earlier. He drove up yesterday from Tuscany to be here with us. So you should go by and say hi to him at his stand. His family has run Fontodi since the beginning. His family background is in making clay pots. They're called orci. They're amphoras. And these were used in Tuscany for olive oil in different containers. There's a clay in a town called Impruneta, which is very thick and it fires well. So Impruneta has always been famous for making these pots, and that's how the Manetti family made its fortune, was selling these orci, these pots. Fontodi is located in Chianti Classico, the region of central Tuscany that's known for Sangiovese. And specifically, it is in the town of Panzano in Chianti, which is one of the most fortunate of the different villages in the appellation. It is known for something called the Conca d'Oro, which you see a beautiful picture of here. The Conca d'Oro in English means the golden basin, because Panzano is just very fortunate to have this huge amphitheater of vines, all southwest facing, and it's an area that captures this beautiful light and warmth, because behind it are higher altitude mountains in the Chianti Classico area, like L'Amole, and those mountains kind of cut off a lot of the colder influences. So the Conca d'Oro really remains this blessed basin of vines, and the Manetti family farms a big part of it. It's all organic, and he uses biodynamics as well. There you can see Giovanni Manetti. There's a photo of him. You'll recognize him, as I said, if you go downstairs. And the reason I chose the second photo here is because the 2016 wine that you have in your glass is a wine that kind of represents a stylistic shift that Giovanni Manetti wanted to embrace. Up until 2016, his oak regime it's always been about half new oak and used oak, Allier mostly, but he uses about 7 different cooperages. But starting with 2016, he started aging a large part of this wine that we are tasting in larger oak casks, 37 hectoliters, bigger containers. And for the first time in this vintage, 2% or very small percentage of the wine is aged in his amphora. So you can see the amphora right there. And basically the idea is to change the dynamic between the wine and the aging vessels and the space, available to him in these different containers, to create more finesse and elegance and silkiness. And I think you can taste that here, especially in the tannins that are very fine and tight. And the wine, of course, has those beautiful Sangiovese aromas that are always kind of a forest fruit, a wild cherry. There's an earthy component here, a little bit of like a rusty nail. And Sangiovese often also shows a blue flower component, like a dried violet or lavender. And I think that this wine definitely shows all of that magic and beauty of Sangiovese. And I was particularly impressed by this very careful work being done in the aging process to finesse, especially the relationship, between the wine and its vessels to create this elegance. The Concadoro and this part of Chianti Classico has limestone and parts of schisty soils. They're called alberese and galestro in Italian is the name of the soils there. And the Concadoro is particularly rich in both these soils. So that's the first wine, the Fontodi. And then we pass on, we go about 200 kilometers, I'd say, towards the Tuscan coast, towards the Tyrrhenian Sea, for wine number 5 that you have in your glass. This is obviously, a wine of enormous pedigree and importance for Italy, the Masetto. It is made in a region called Bolgheri, which is on the coast of Tuscany. And this region is very special because it is characterized by very shallow hills that go right down towards the sea. And on a beautiful sunny day, you can see the islands in the background. You can even see a little bit of Corsica and Sardinia in the far distance. And the light hits the sea, the Tyrrhenian Sea, and kind of reflects back upon the land in coastal Tuscany in this area of Bolgheri. So it's kind of a wash in this beautiful, very strong light. The soils here are crazy because a lot of it is alluvial coming down from the hills towards the seaside, so you get patches of lots of different soils. But the thing that set Masetto apart was that it is planted, it's about 6 hectares, the vineyard. It's been enlarged a little bit since then, but back when this vintage was made, about 6 hectares of a kind of a grayish blue clay soil that really only just existed there. The Tenuta di Ornellaia, which is the, let's say, mother group that makes Masetto, was founded by Ludovico Antinori of the Antinori family. And then over the years, in a kind of crazy Medici drama, the ownership of Tenuta di Ornellaia went from the Antinori family to its biggest rivals, the Frescobaldi family, the current owners of the property. So the winemaker in the next slide, he's actually the general manager now. Oh, here you can see, this is the photo of the Masetto vineyard. Actually is right behind this first row of vines. It's a little bit hidden in this photo, but you can see how isolated and desolate this landscape is. Most of all of this area of coastal Tuscany was for game hunting. So there's only a few little villages there. It's actually quite it's kind of a lonely place. But vines find a natural home there. There's Axel Heinz. He's the general manager of both Tenuta di Ornellaia and Masetto that have now been spun off in 2 separate corporate identities, if you will. And Masetto just recently, about 3 years ago, inaugurated, right before COVID, its brand new winery. So that's one of the first pictures I was able to take inside the winery of Masetto. Now, of course, Masetto is Merlot, as I said. It's 100% new oak, as you can definitely smell when you put the glass to your nose. There's that sweetness that comes from the Merlot, the ripeness of Tuscany. I mean, it is, all that warmth and sunshine of the Tuscan coast is really just permeated in this dark, rich, succulent fruit. It ages for about 24 months. Again, with an Allier fine grain oak. So these are 2 different expressions from Tuscany that I hope you will enjoy. And that's it. So I think the next wine, actually, I'm passing the microphone to my esteemed colleague, William. And I think we were supposed to introduce ourselves, or I was supposed to introduce William, but we've done that a little bit in the past. So here you go, William, to you.
Thank you very much, Monica. I'm afraid I don't have any slides, but Cheval Blanc normally does okay speaking for itself. It's an interesting winery. For me, it's one of the most complex wines in Bordeaux, and there are two real reasons for that, I would say. The first is the huge diversity of soils. Cheval Blanc sits on the site of an old river delta from back at the end of the glacial period when all of the sort of ice was melting and carrying stones, fine silt, sands out from the Pyrenees and from the Massif Central. And there was a river delta at Cheval Blanc. In the lower lying parts of that delta where the rivulets once flowed, you have clay soils. That's where they tend to plant Merlot. And on the higher parts, you have a very complex mix of gravel and sand. And it really changes from parcel to parcel, a matter of meters, very diverse. I think that's reflected in the wine. Absolutely. It also makes it quite a complicated wine to produce because you have to harvest each block separately, and Cheval Blanc have been doing a lot of work to break down the vineyard, to farm it differently parcel by parcel, and to vinify it differently parcel by parcel, to have the optimal finished wines to then blend together to make a blended wine, which is, of course, the Bordelais tradition. In fact, you could probably produce 50 different wines off of Cheval Blanc's vineyard. The other really interesting thing about Cheval Blanc that I think contributes to its complexity and sometimes makes it a hard wine for people to understand is it's absolutely a chameleon of a wine. Because you have roughly equal parts of Merlot and Cabernet Franc, two very different grape varieties combined. Now, in this sector of Saint-Emilion, before the cataclysmic frost of 1956, which killed vast numbers of vines, there was actually a lot of Cabernet Franc. This wasn't the only estate, but Cheval Blanc and to some extent Figeac were the two estates that really perpetuated this tradition. There are a couple of other small ones. Definitely outliers in a Merlot-dominated right bank today. And you have different vintages, I think, which express one more than the other. A vintage like 1998, Cheval Blanc is Merlot, and it's right on the Pomerol border. I often say Cheval Blanc is the best wine made in Pomerol, to be provocative, because the soils are much more characteristic of Pomerol, in fact, than they are of the majority of sites in Saint-Emilion. But you have other vintages too, 1982, for example, 2011, vintages like that, where Cabernet Franc really dominates the character of the wine, and it's rather more ethereal, rather less fleshy, more aromatic, more fine. And so people find it difficult to understand sometimes because you can go from a vintage like 2010, a very rich, muscular, powerful, to a very floral, perfume vintage like 11, right, side by side from the same estate. The 9 for me is a vintage that isn't dominated by either one or the other. And typically vintages like that, it tends to be Cabernet Franc that takes over as time passes. Right now I think it's in a very sort of balanced place. It begins to open up after a sort of closed phase. But it's a rather powerful vintage of Cheval Blanc, which is not always Bordeaux's most powerful wine. It's rather broad-shouldered, quite textured. I think it's beginning to show rather nicely today. But really, it's also one of those wines which has a very unique presence, very unique character that it expresses, and it's really typically interesting no matter what the vintage. So I hope you enjoyed the 2009. And over to my colleague Anthony to talk about Washington.
Hello, I'm Anthony Mueller, reviewer for Washington State and South Africa. And for wine number 7, we have the 2013 Quilceda Creek Cabernet Sauvignon Blanc. I recently tasted through a 20-year vertical of Quilceda Creek. Last year, published that. And better? Okay. I recently tasted through a 20-year vertical of Quilceda Creek last year, and the 13 was one wine that caught my attention, caught my eye. When I was tasting it, you could get this sense of completeness with the wine. When you smell it, you get a fair amount of oak that jumps out. There is this robustness, this glossy nature. When I was tasting it, I even put it in the very bottom few sentences of my notes that I thought this wine would probably drink well for the next year or so and then start to shut down. As all red wines do with time, they shut down, they kind of enter that chrysalis phase, or I like to call it the teenage years. If you have a teenage child or a teenage kid, you can't really treat them like a child. You can't really treat them like an adult. It's those weird tween years that things kind of are just kind of wonky. And I think right now it's at that point where it's starting to shut down. You get that brightness, that opulence of fruits with the overlay of luscious French oak. This producer just celebrated 40 years of making high quality wines Robert Parker, when he would go visit them, essentially called them, the first growth of Washington State. The family was first started, or the winery was first started by the Glitzen family, Alex and his wife. The son, Paul, he's now in charge of everything. There are a few pictures here. So went too fast. Go one more back. There you go. So here on the top left corner, we've got Paul. He's in black there. They're looking at actually planting the Shampoo vineyard back in 1997. You have actually Paul with the first plantings on the top right, and then the 20-year lineup at the Napa office, and all of the beautiful wines, and then another vineyard shot. But this, I think, perfectly captures what Washington is all about. Washington, the Columbia Valley specifically, people think of Washington, they think of Seattle, think of rain, they think of forests. The Columbia Valley, once you get over the Cascades, it basically becomes high desert. You're talking about a region that only gets about 8 inches of rain a year. Specifically, this is the bottom right-hand corner. This is their new Mach 1 vineyard, so you can see how wide the Columbia River is there. And they have a beautiful planting of Cabernet and Merlot in that vineyard, and it's working really well for them. So if you could go to the next slide. Perfect. This is kind of a little bit of storytelling with the son, Paul, who's currently the director of winemaking. The top right-hand corner, it's a really interesting shot that they shared with me for the 20-year vertical. The gentleman dead center with the red shirt, that is Andrei Chelichev, which is also known as the Dean of American Winemaking, made a lot of history in Napa Valley. That just happens to be Paul's uncle, so it's through his mother's side of the family. What they did is that's actually Paul himself. As a teenager, they sent him to France as a teenage kid to learn how to make wine, and that's actually him doing punch downs. And this is on the left-hand side, Paul himself with the new white wine bottles they're finally doing. They were a red house only until just this last year. Well, technically their whites will arrive at the fall, at the end of this year. They have a Sauvignon Blanc and the Quasilda Blanc, very much like the style of white Bordeaux houses, with having a main red and a house white as well. A lot of oak here, typically 70 to 100% new French oak, and they tend to be glossy. When I'm tasting this wine, when I first came in the room, I tasted all the wines, and for me, number 7 is the wine that's changed the most for me. So I think it's in that point of shutting down. And when I talk about them, I know I'd say let this sit for another 4 or 5 years in the cellar, and then approach it then. It's so you get this sense of the opulence, the alcohol here. It is a robust, generous wine. But when you think of robust, generous wines, I think everything in balance. So if you have a lot of alcohol, a lot of juiciness, a lot of oak makes a lot of sense as well. So with that, I will pass back to my colleague, William.
So, Aaron Brooks, who's responsible for reviewing this part of California where Sine Qua Non comes from, can't be here today. So I'm going to say a few words about Sine Qua Non. I visited the winery a bunch of times and reviewed the Central Coast for one brief year for the Wine Advocate, for several years when I was at Decanter Magazine. Manfred Krankel had a very fascinating entrepreneurial sort of story, coming to the United States and running a very successful bakery, a very successful restaurant with a wine program. And the genesis of Sine Qua Non was originally to produce house wine for this restaurant. This was back in the mid-90s, something 1991, 2, 3, that sort of zone, and just by chance, somebody sent one of these bottles to Robert Parker, who tasted it, who loved it, and sort of exploded it, and it became this big phenomenon. It was, back then it was sort of garage project. Now a very big, expensive, state-of-the-art architectural winery, their own vineyards, in addition to purchased fruit. I think for me, it was one of the wineries of the Central Coast that really tried to push things as far as they could go, and then some. Extremely late picking, de-leafing, low yields, lots and lots of new oak. So the wines that are very powerful, potent, with a real sort of sucrosity of late picked fruit, a real richness and sweetness and power. So this is a Grenache-based blend that we have here. And normally it will be, they do rather long maturation in barrel, so this would have seen quite a long time in barrel. But I think it's very typical of the style, especially the contemporary style, because like all producers, they've had those sort of eras. I think they got more and more powerful in the mid 2000s. Maybe the reds calmed down a little bit lately, and the whites got a bit richer and more oaky. But these are the sort of things that every winery has its stylistic epochs as tastes change. And 2015 was also, I think, the moment when Manfred had some. After his motorcycle accident he had a terrible, almost fatal motorcycle accident. It took him several years to rehabilitate. So I think this was also sort of a vintage that was made in part by his team. Does this mean I introduce myself for the next one? I think so. Hey, okay, so it's me again. Sorry. 2009 Yquem. I think I've got an easy one here because 2009 very famous, celebrated. Vintage in Bordeaux, and particularly for the reds, and yet for me the wine of the vintage in 2009 Bordeaux is actually a Yquem. I think it's beginning to show incredibly. For me, it's the best Yquem since probably 1967. To be rather more complete, integrated, harmonious aromatically than the 2001. 2001 tastes today, even though it's older, quite a lot oakier. 2009 already extremely integrated and seamless. Extremely powerful, concentrated wine. I think the challenge with these sorts of wines is knowing when do you drink it. Everybody, when you taste it, appreciates its greatness, its compelling qualities, its timeless qualities, and it will live for pretty much forever. But yet, the challenge of integrating sweet wines into a sort of modern diet, modern lifestyle is quite difficult to overcome. But why is Yquem so special? I think there are a variety of factors. It's a very favoured site. 2021, when everywhere else in Sauternes Barsac was completely cataclysmically destroyed by frost, Yquem was the only vineyard that was spared. So it's an ideal situation on a sort of big gravel clay croupe, as the French would say, a dome. It's also been it's a human product as well, including the terroir, because it was extensively drained in the mid 19th century. So the hand of man has also contributed to making it a favoured place, and because of its valorization in the market, they can afford to do things that other people in Sauternes would sometimes struggle to. Picking really many different successive different passages through the vineyard to pick only the botrytis, the right grapes, and then making obviously a very rigorous selection. There's some years when they don't produce a Yquem, which is something that other estates in the Sauternes should sometimes consider doing, but it's economically very difficult to write off an entire year's production. So like Cheval Blanc, owned by LVMH, formerly owned by the de Selous family, who still have Chateau de Fargue, which is made in a similar style. And very traditional winemaking, so this is vertical press, aged fermented in new oak barrels, can ferment for, a very long time. And, typically a wine like this, I guess, would have something like 120 grams per litre residual sugar, maybe 150, something in that sort of territory. So it's definitely sweet and immense capacities for longevity. So with that, I will pass you over to Louis, who is also standing in for a colleague.
Yes, Mark Squires, who reviews the wines from Portugal, Greece, and other regions. He couldn't make it today. And as I live in Spain, I'm the closest to Portugal. And and I like Portuguese wines very much, and I love port. I am officially a Caballero da Confraria do Vinho do Porto, so I promise to drink port for the rest of my life, and I'm going to fulfill that promise today. We have a wine from Taylor's, one of the English houses producing port. their style is usually quite sweet, and wines for really the long term that I like to drink after 40 or 50 years. This is 2000. It's starting to show what a great vintage port can show with time. This is a wine, if you look at the name, that says Quinta de Barguella's Viña Bella. Viña Bella means old vines, but in Portuguese, and especially in the port, Viña Bella has a meaning that goes beyond old vines, because all the old vines are mixed grape varieties, and there's probably 20 to 30 different grape varieties in this field blend of the Viña Bella. So when you see a Portuguese wine that says Viña Bella, it's not only that it's old vines, but it's not a varietal wine. It's a field blend of many different grape varieties, which I think adds a lot to the complexity of the wine. Later they selected, like 4 different varieties to plant in the Douro, because planting 30 is crazy. In the old times they had the time, and they didn't have finance directors and return on investment and all this bullshit from the modern companies, and they had the time to experiment and plant, and the field blends are different, in different places according to altitude and exposition and so on and so forth. So this is a typical old vine field blend. The vintage port, which is of course a fortified wine, they normally produce it sweeter than this. This is probably a more Portuguese style of port, less sweet than the Taylors normally are, which I prefer. It's a matter of taste, but I would rather take something like this than very sweet, because I think the challenge with sweet wines is to don't show too sweet, the same as tannic wines. You don't want them to be too tannic, or oaky wines, you don't want them to be too oaky. You want balance, and I think that the magic word is balance, and I find it here. I think this will be terrific in another 30, 40, 50 years. Because I've had the luck to drink, ports from 1840 onwards, so I can tell you they age very well. And these wines are still produced more or less like in the past, In lagars, the grapes are foot trodden, and then they age in wood for a short time, and then they have to age in bottle. The vintage port is aged in bottle.
I don't know where I made a mistake, but up there I see 2016, and down here I see 2000.
Sorry.
It's 2000.
It's a 2000.
2016. No. This is 2000. This is 2000.
I'm getting old, that's why I want to be sure.
No. Yeah.
Mistake on the slide.
This is why Mark didn't come, huh?
In fact, if you read the note, it says the 2000. So it's just a mistake in the header.
No, it's 2000. So this wine is now 22 years old. Really, I think that 63 and 70 are the vintages to drink now. So I would give this a little bit more time. Not to this bottle, of course. Yeah? Yeah. So, Joe, back to you.
All right, so that wraps up individual presentations of the wines. If you guys have any questions, now's the time, because we've got a few minutes, except for Stefan, who had to run because his next masterclass starts at 1 o'clock. So, if you have any questions. Was it you've got? No. No, that was the 10th wine, the Taylor. Sauternes was number 9. William talked about that. It's yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, anyone have questions, first of all? Questions? Loudly.
No, that's a great question. So Flaccinello starts off as a single vineyard. In fact, Flaccinello della Pieve means the vineyard, or the name of the vineyard right by the church, because there's a little teeny church at the top of the Concadoro. So it starts off that way, but over time, then the Manetti family decided to make it a selection. So the fruit for Flaccinello is actually a blend from 7 or 9 different sites within the Concadoro each year. He selects the best ones. So it's a selection of the best fruit in the Manetti holdings in the Concadoro. It's no longer that particular vineyard site of next to the church, like its name. He has another wine called Vigna del Sorbo, which is a single vineyard in a specific part of the Concadoro, also Sangiovese, 100%. Yes, I think that. So so we're drinking the 2016 right now. So this is actually, to me, quite young. I think that, I would say more than 10 years, but I would say maybe 30 years. I've had the great pleasure of tasting a full retrospective of Flaccinello, and there are ups and downs, but the aging trajectory is a good 35 years plus, I would say, yeah. I mean, it's interesting now because I'm the reviewer who scored the 2 Italian wines, so I can say this. But the Flaccinello is much more interesting to me than the Maceto. And the Maceto is just, there's a lot of that sweetness and the cherry and the exuberance of the vintage and the wine and the place. It's almost, it's almost too much, right? Do you want to drink a whole bottle of that, But I'm particularly touched by how the Flaccinello is showing today, because it's very beautiful. Very nice tightness, and then the more you go back to the glass, you get that kind of earthiness that really brings me to a sense of place. I think the Flaccinello shows beautifully. So.
Anyone else? Any more questions? Because otherwise, I'm going to just ask some of my colleagues to opine on wines that they do not review, because I think that'll be interesting. And maybe I'll start. I think for me, look, they're all 100-point wines, but that doesn't mean one can't seem better than the others on any given day. And for me, one of the wines that stands out is the Cheval Blanc. I find that just to be really, really singing now. And I'm glad we had that wine here. Just beautiful complexity, the contrast between the rich plumminess of the clay, the Merlot, with those higher tones, those florals, those herbal notes of the Cabernet Franc. Just I think, fantastic. Yeah.
I did it last night.
Great. Luis, is there one you'd like to talk about that's not one that you reviewed?
Well, really, the one that I liked was also the Cheval Blanc. When you go to the sweet wines, they are very different. So I think both the Yquem and the Taylors, they showed very well. But I was very, very impressed by the Cheval Blanc. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, why not?
You got to talk about a wine that's not.
This is not the Cheval Blanc. No, but it's interesting to see such a diversity of styles. Yeah, I mean, I do confess that I do like the wines that I'm responsible for, even though it wasn't me who reviewed them. So I don't feel any sort of party pre to say that I do. Yeah, no, it was interesting also to try the Ariana, which I found very elegant. It shows, similar things happened in Bordeaux in the last decade. That's happened in Argentina, frankly. Even Cheval Blanc today is making more refined, more perfumed wines than even they were in 2009. So if you like the 2009, you should really consider getting some of the 19. Our article on that comes out at the end of this week, by the way. So, consider that a bonus for your ticket. But it's, I think generally you can see across, whether it's Tallbrag, even to some extent Corsita and Sine Qua Non, over the last decade, the whole wine world has made a move towards not necessarily picking earlier, because some of these wines are still very high, alcohol wines, but there has been a trend to refining cooperage choices, to integrating oak flavors better, to greater precision in tannins, to preserving that sort of fruit character, which was obviously always, these wines were always very fruity young, but sometimes they lost that fruit in aging because the élevage was a bit too oxidative, the winemaking was a bit too oxidative. There's a real progression to sort of retaining more vibrancy of fruit and not obscuring it with makeup in the whole wine world today. I think to some extent, Monica, that's perhaps why Mazzetto seems like a bit of an outlier in this context, because it's so lactic and creamy, and that, you get the malolactic bacteria, a bit of Taranceau in there. I mean, I buy some barrels from Taranceau, so I have nothing against them, but I've got one of their umbrellas in the back of my car, but it's interesting, yeah, and I think that's something you see in the whole range, and if you taste the wines that these estates are making 10 years later, I suspect that we're going to see the continuation of that theme.
Yeah, it was my first time trying the Unlicht, the 2018 FX Pichler, and I thought it was a very unctuous wine. When I think of Grüner Veltliner from Austria, I think of a little bit more austerity, acid, peppery, but this had a lot of unctuousness to it. This had power, this had grip, this had even a touch of botrytis for me as well. This had power and weight and texture, and it was quite delightful. When trying the Torbrecht Rundrig, it's like, this is classic. Classic, Aussie Shiraz, firing on all cylinders. The between the Fantati and the Massetto, I myself had a preference for the Fantati. Had a little bit more of that, that acid-driven grip that just is food-friendly, and I just started thinking about, oh God, what would I pair with this? Like, I want maybe like ossobuco or some lamb chops, or the Cheval Blanc was beautiful, but my preference for the entire flight, as you can see from my glass, is the 2009 Yquem, as it is completely empty. And whenever I have a chance to enjoy Yquem, I never turn the opportunity down. And the fact I didn't spit a single drop today. It's beautiful, beautiful wines. But yeah, cool. Any additions?
Monica, you want to share any of your views on some of the non-Italian stuff?
Yes, and then I would like to ask the audience too what you guys liked. But I will say that I loved wine number 1 and number 2. That was really, I thought this tasting opened up in a spectacular way with Stefan's wine. The intensity, the beauty, it just kind of reset my palate, got me ready for this whole tasting. And the Argentinian wine, Luis, I thought was beautiful. Beautifully delicate, elegant, graceful, very lifted, very bright. So, I mean, I thought that was, those are 2 wines that I was not as familiar with, so it was a wonderful way to start this off. And then, I mean, obviously the other big hitters that we all know. But I guess so. Maybe we should show hands, maybe, of what, if anybody, should I do this? So, all right. So, did anybody have? I guess raise your hand if your favorite wine of the day was one of the first 3. Okay. 3. Okay. So how about if your favorite wine of the day was either number 4, 5, or 7? Okay, 1. Yay! Or 2. Yay! And how about, I will skip the Yquem, but how about whose favorite wine was either 6, 8, or 10? I'll put the port in there. Okay, we got most of the... Okay. And whose favorite wine was number 9, Yquem? Okay, 1. Okay, 2. Okay, good. 3 in the back there. So, okay, so whose favorite wine is the Cheval Blanc? Okay, all right. There you go. I'll pass the microphone back to Joe.